The defining feature of ancient religion and philosophy is its boldness, at least in contrast to our modern religion and philosophy, which is kind of one track. It's focusing on sort of one set of presumptions, and there's an openness in the ancient world. And the reason that they had that is because they hadn't yet come to the paradigm which has dominated, at least thinking in the West. Um, so the reason that they were so bold is that in in face of having no common paradigm, there was no reason to deny all of the varied parts of the human soul. So we come into the earth and we have all these different potentials. We could become so many different things. And because in the era before the Christian era, at least this is just talking about the West, before the Christian era, people were able to think outside of that box. We have been thinking inside the Christian box for 2,000 years. And if we go back to the ancients before Christ, we see a kind of thought which is not as constrained as ours. And that allowed them to live by a variety of modes of experience and also of understanding. So their concept of knowledge was nowhere near as strict and one track as ours. Now, one of the things that was possible to do in the ancient world, because of this lack of a paradigm, because of this lack of a constraint, was it was possible to foreground feeling and intuition as modes and guides to life. And what I mean by that is, for us, really, we can't live our lives by feeling or intuition, or at least we can't admit that publicly. Of course, there are people who do live by feeling and intuition, but if you ask them why they're doing what they're doing, oftentimes they'll try and wrap it up into some kind of cause and effect explanation, but that's not really what's going on. Although the fact that everyone is so convinced of this thought first, logos first attitude, clearly that penetrates people's soul. It's not just a matter of living your own life by feeling and intuition, but when one of these logos people comes along, one of these Christian priests comes along, you then translate your intuitive or feeling or sensorious life into a life of words, but rather the constant presence of the priest actually causes people to live by the word, even if it's not in their disposition. So we had this division that arose only after the ancient period, where we had to subjugate all of our other modes of experience and of thought and understanding under the rubric of the Logos. And the reason that we had to do that was because if we go to the ancient Greek world, where we had these people who were multifaceted, the hero was someone who manifested himself across a wide range of disciplines and activities. But the thing is, in the ancient Greek world, is you had a huge proportion of the population was slaves. So, in ancient Greece, it was just accepted that half of the population would have to be subjugated in order that the remaining half, the aristocratic class, would have the freedom and resources and tools to become heroes, to manifest each one of their passions and desires and all of their potential. They could manifest it as a whole person. They could bring together feeling and sensation and intuition and thought and art. They could bring it all together in war. They could bring it all together in one human. And that's what the Greek hero ideal is. But their society reflected the division had to come somewhere, and for them the division was in the society where half the population were slaves. Now there was a transition where we moved on from that slave attitude. And the reason, of course, is that the slaves started making quite a lot of fuss and threatened the aristocratic class. what happened as a result of the slave class being removed is that the division had to show up somewhere. So instead of the division showing up in society, where one group is allowed to flourish while the other is subjugated, we took that same division, and that same division became a psychological one. So instead of slaves, instead of the plebs being slaves, instead we made our feeling, intuition, and sensation slaves. We subjugated them all to the word. We subjugated them to the logos. Now, in the same way that the slaves were really necessary for the aristocracy in Greece, there could not have been a Plato or an Aristotle if they hadn't been slaves. Someone had to build the gymnasium. Someone had to build the academy. And of course, if Plato and Aristotle had had to spend their time doing that, then they wouldn't have been able to manifest their potential in the way that they did. And of course, let's think about it. If it hadn't been for Plato and Aristotle, where would we be in our culture? They're an unbelievably potent set of cultural contributions came from those two men, and also from many of the ancient Greeks. And it's only because they had this attitude that they were sort of the chosen ones. They were the ones who were out to manifest themselves, and it was the slaves who were not to manifest themselves. Now we have that experience in our own minds. We have to choose one particular mode of living, usually one oriented around the logos. We have to subjugate all our other modes of experience and understanding to the logos. So we have the same kind of slave and master division inside of our own souls at this point, and we move really far into this one. So we've become much more divided psychologically than any time in the past, but more unified socially. Well, actually, let's think about modern society. Maybe we haven't been that unified socially, but certainly we don't have a literal slave class. I'm not suggesting that we're at the end point with society, but we don't have this clear distinction between the worthy and the unworthy. At least nowadays, even if you're part of the elite class in our society, you still have to lie to yourself and tell you that things are actually fair. There's very few people who are just ruthlessly self-interested in our culture. Although, maybe that's growing. Maybe that's growing as this ion of the logos is coming to an end. So for us, when we grow up from children, what that actually means is setting aside most of who we are. It means setting aside feeling and intuition and sensation, and seeking to develop trying to repurpose all that energy that might have gone into those other realms, repurposing that energy to go straight into one function. So for most of us, that is the word function. And the other parts of us, fade into the background. We have this division. All the energy goes to the one function which we are developing, and that is essentially you can see the utility of that by understanding kind of Adam Smith's notion of surplus value when we divide labor. If we have 10 blacksmiths making pins all day long, each one can really only make 10, 15 pins a day, because there's multiple stages of the process. You have to go between different machines, and it really takes quite a lot of time to move between all the different tasks. There's a lot of wasted time. Whereas if we get 10 blacksmiths, or even 10 unskilled laborers, to do 1/10 of the job of making a pin, it's very easy to train them, because their job might just be, cutting a certain length of wire, or firing the kiln, or twisting something, sort of welding things together. Very basic tasks don't take much time to train. And if we have the same 10 people in a chain gang of work, we end up with far more product at the end of the day than we could with 10 highly skilled individual workers. So it's because we, in order to function as a coherent society, we're not thinking about society as a tool, as a stepping stone to a great man, as the Greeks did. They thought that the slaves, of course, we need the slaves because ultimately what we're after is arete, we're after manifesting our intellect. We're after growing and becoming and manifesting our potential in the greatest way possible. And that's the point. That's the point for the ancients. But for us, the point is general social well-being, because we realize that if we have this division between the ruling class and the slave class, that the slave class just gets really uppity and eventually takes down the ruling class. So we have to move on from that, but it's produced this problem where we're all just become one-track things, because in order, we have to subjugate ourselves to society. We're all essentially slaves to a greater ideal of society, and because of that, we have to subjugate most of our own passions and redirect them towards one. And you can see the reason why, because we are able to generate more product at the end. We're able to do more if we focus ourselves on one task. But the consequence is that we become obviously one-sided. And if you have read something like The Death of Ivan Ilyich, I think what happens there is, he's a lawyer or he's a judge, and he feels that he's attained status and he has a family that looks good, at least from the outside, and he has close friends. But he realizes only after he has to face death that really, even though he's been climbing through the ranks of the profession of law, it has been inauthentic. He's been following someone else's path, and he realizes that his whole life, while he thought he was ascending through the ranks, really he was getting further and further away from the thing that really matters, which is authentic being. And this one-sided attitude we have in our culture, it kind of manifests itself that way in many people, where you become one-sided. And we have this notion of the midlife crisis. And the reason that happens is because you become so one-sided, and eventually the rest of you just starts to rise up and take dominance in the same way that the ancient Greek slaves rose up and attacked the aristocracy. So there's a sort of slave revolt in psychology which is taking place now. And, if we analyze this in terms of Nietzsche's will to power, the other passions have their own will to power and will to expression. And they won't sit idly by and countenance the dominance of the logos forever. So I think the time where we can be one-sided is coming to an end. There was a time where society could be one-sided. It could be all about the aristocratic class. But that came to an end when it was rammed against its fatal flaw of a slave class. And now our era of the aristocracy of the one-sided man, he is now being overthrown by the subjugated slave, which is the rest of his own passions. And we need to move now into a new realm. And I think perhaps we will regain the openness and passion of the Greeks and the ancients, who were open to new things, because we have to be now. We can't even hold on to this logos first attitude because it's crumbling around us. God is dead. So we must resurrect something. We must make a God. And if we really want to go about that task, we have to open ourselves to novelty and richness, just in the same way that the ancient Greeks were.